I'm very happy to introduce our final speaker, Jennie King. Jennie King is the head of climate research and policy at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And until January, she also served as head of education and civic action, co-authoring the curriculum Be Internet Citizens. She currently advises the, quote, Making Sense of Media Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group within Ofcom, which is the UK regulator with devolved responsibility for actioning the government's national media literacy agenda. Jennie, please tell us a little bit about how caregivers and educators can do better about teaching youth about these problems.
Sure, thank you for having me. I think the first thing I'd like to do is for everyone just to take a breath, because that was a lot of very overwhelming information about the toxicity on the internet and the diversity of online harms that not only young people are facing, but anyone who wants to interact with digital platforms may well encounter or be exposed to. And I think from my experience of working both with formal education systems, with regulators and governments, but also with, everyday people who have kids, people who work with younger demographics, is this sense that they themselves lack the confidence or the connective tissue to share a vocabulary with talking to their own children or to their students about these topics. That the kinds of spaces that these young people are occupying may be entirely alien to their own experience. And as a result, they feel like they lack the kind of tools in their armory to engage in a good faith way, in a way that feels relevant and contemporary, and as a result that they can't support safer, more inclusive experiences online for the young people that they most care about. And what I want to emphasize from the start is I don't believe that that's the case. And I also don't believe that you need to have the level of granular expertise that has been, incredible to see today in the other speakers in order to provide a constructive sounding board for young people in helping them to navigate whichever online communities they're a part of in a safer way. So that's the first thing I want to say is please don't despair. Of course, there are trends that reach a critical mass of exposure that you might feel it is worth understanding more about. And I think at the moment, extreme misogyny and the kind of manosphere, as it's called, or incel ideology, and how that kind of rhetoric is becoming more and more prevalent, particularly in classrooms and among young men, that might be something that you think, okay, I would like to understand more about that. I want to raise my literacy. Equally, when conspiracies like QAnon or the New World Order start to penetrate mainstream media and get that level of oxygen, at that point you might think, okay, I need to understand a little bit more about the specifics of this if I'm going to engage in good faith with my child or with a student. But what I would say in general is you're never going to be able to keep up with the evolving landscape online. And so if you're constantly holding yourself to that standard, you're going to feel on the back foot eternally. 3 years ago, TikTok didn't exist. 2 years ago, deep fake audio and really sophisticated deep fake imagery were not endemic online. 6 months ago, ChatGPT didn't exist and the bold glamour filter on TikTok had not been launched. So it's very difficult for you to constantly anticipate the new trends. And instead, I would really encourage people to focus on the core principles and competencies that help young people or any people to engage with information and to reflect on their own experience as a consumer of content and the way that they engage with that content in the safest and most constructive way, rather than the specifics of whichever trend is, generating crisis or panic amongst the general public at a given point in time. So, we have a theory of change for work that we've done, in particular the Be Internet Citizens curriculum. And I guess it takes you on a journey from basic e-safety through to what we call digital citizenship. And for everybody on this call, it's really a case of where you feel you're most able to engage, but also recognizing that all three of these things are important. So at the very basic level, you have what are the tools or what's the lens that we can help young people to apply when they're coming across anything online, whether it's hateful content, legal but harmful content, disinformative content, all the way through to the more extreme and radicalizing end of the spectrum. But beyond that, you don't just want it to be a passive exercise. It's also about creating environments and the role that each individual plays in structuring the online communities that they're a part of. And the fact that by being a consumer of content, you are more often than not also a producer of content in what you repost, in what you tweet, in the comments that you add on other people's videos. All of that contributes to the energy of a particular space, and also its level of inclusivity and the kind of nature of discourse that takes place in that particular environment. So, when we talk about digital citizenship, what we're really encouraging is a conversation around what it means to be a good member of society in environments where you may never meet the people that you're engaging with face to face. And that sounds like a kind of self-explanatory idea. But when we think about citizenship offline, we have very specific kind of tenets of social behavior that are kind of built into our way of thinking. So being a good citizen might mean that you pay your taxes, or you vote in elections, or you pick up litter in your local area, or you are friendly with your neighbors. But we don't really have this parallel framework or rubric of thinking about what it means to be a member of society when that society takes place entirely in this kind of mediated online format. So, aside from anything else, one of the main things that we encourage both parents and educators and practitioners to do is to have that conversation. What kind of web do you want to be a part of as a young person? What is your manifesto for the internet? And how do you as an individual contribute to building that kind of environment, both in the way that you police your peers' behavior and in the way that you police your own behavior? I'm not going to delve into this diagram. It's a nice visual aid to have in the background since, it's got colors on it. But the reason why I wanted to show this is that I also want to emphasize the point that it's not always about things that you can teach, that there are also huge elements of this that are to do with how young people feel and what they're encouraged or how they feel part of a cultural moment. So, there has been more and more attention paid in recent years to creating digital literacy or media literacy curricula that can be delivered through formal education environments. And that is absolutely essential. It's really important that we integrate that into our systems. But it's not the end of the journey. You could spend an entire year teaching young people about what mis and disinformation means, what the motivation is behind that content, radicalization pathways, all of these things. And it doesn't mean that the next time they log on, they're actually going to have changed their behavior. And so another, thing that I think people can do really easily is to try and highlight positive examples, both in their own lives or in broader culture, that make young people feel like, okay, there is an incentive for me to think about these issues, to engage with them proactively. Because more often than not, what we're seeing play out in the mainstream media is more of the toxicity. It's more of the finger pointing at, look, the adults are just as bad. The adults are all falling prey to fake news. The adults are driving us versus them narratives. The adults are leaning into the most kind of polarizing and divisive forms of rhetoric. So why are you then coming to us and preaching about the fact that we need to be aware of hate speech, or we need to be resistant to extremist ideologies? There's a kind of fundamental disconnect here. So there's all of these things about encouraging young people to find ways that they can enact the things that they care about and believe in the digital space in the same way that they might do by volunteering offline or contributing to a cause. So I just wanted to kind of lay out what we've highlighted in this diagram, which is the distinction between things that can be taught, things that can be facilitated, and things that can be encouraged, and the fact that all of them have equal weight in really tackling this at a systemic level. The next is most of the speakers on the call so far have spoken about extremism, and extremism is, to an extent, the most downstream part of this problem, right? It's what happens at the end of a journey. But in the curricula that we write, we're really keen to emphasize that extremism doesn't exist in a vacuum. Disinformation, hate, and extremism are a very complicated and interconnected web in the online space, and that it's very difficult to talk about one in a way that is isolated from the other. So if you don't feel like you have the confidence or the understanding to really delve into the weeds of a specific extremist ideology, I would encourage thinking much more about the upstream elements of this, which is, what is the purpose of information online? Is it there to inspire? Is it there to teach? Is it there to create belonging and identity? Is it there to polarize? Is it there to generate advertising revenue? You know, thinking about the relationship between the individual and what they're consuming, and then how a lot of these extremist ideologies are based in fundamental misunderstandings that are driven by algorithms, that are driven by online filter bubbles and echo chambers. And I've put some of the key definitions that we use in showing these are layers, right? You start out with bias or misinformation. Over time, that can drive people into these online echo chambers where their opinions are constantly being reinforced. There's never any challenge, where you get identity fusion, as Alex was saying. You're subsumed into these kind of tribal communities that take on a sort of cultish sentiment to them. And over time, that means that hate speech is not challenged, or you don't even have a perception of what hate speech is, because everybody is echoing the same things. And then the final, I think, pro tip that I would give, and this is the next two slides, is rather than talking about these things in the abstract or trying to, sit down and have a conversation with your kids about ISIS, which isn't necessarily going to feel particularly resonant to their everyday lives, is instead encourage them to think about some of the principles as it relates to them. So, us versus them, yes, we can talk about religion, we can talk about sexual politics, we can talk about nationality, but what about the things that are more likely to occur in their online experiences, like stan culture in music, or the tribal affiliations that they have to a sports team, or the way that, political rhetoric is so divided? What are the kinds of things that they might come across when they're on a gaming platform? And these are just some scenarios that we use. Sit down and ask them, if you were on a gaming platform and somebody posted a swastika, what would you do? And we give these scenarios to parents and teachers, and some of them are absolutely horrified and say, well, shouldn't they just go to the police? But most of these things don't cross a threshold for criminal prosecution, and they are absolutely routine, everyday experiences. So rather than kind of being terrified about them, confront them head on. You have a friend who says a racial slur. You're on a platform and someone comments with a homophobic joke. Someone posts a meme that mocks people with disabilities. What do you do? And work through those scenarios with them and be humble about how you might act in those particular encounters. Then the final thing that I wanted to say is look for the positive role models. What I think Alex mentioned this by saying the vast majority of people who engage with gaming platforms are getting something positive. It's contributing something constructive to their lives. And that's true for the internet as a whole. It's very easy for us to focus on the worst and darkest pockets of it and go down the rabbit hole. But there are clearly huge benefits to being part of an online community and to having a personalized web. And so understanding who are the influencers that your students or your children idolize online, and really unpicking with them, why do you like them? How do they communicate? How do they create spaces that are inclusive for different people? How are they challenging ideas that you find interesting? And sort of understanding who are the people that they see as gatekeepers or as trusted intermediaries, and which parts of that behavior would they like to model themselves, that goes a long way to sort of instilling them with values, which will then produce resilience against some of the biggest online harms. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I think that was a wonderful note to end on, both in terms of the practical ways that parents, and really anyone in the community can work to positive change. And I think you brought up something that's just essential, which is that radicalization and especially violence are the absolute worst case outcome of these dynamics. But these dynamics also they bear kind of a chronic weight on society, and there's really no easy distinction between the polarization, some of the hostility, the ambient misogyny, other forms of supremacy that we live with in our societies, and then the more acute expressions that we can easily identify as extremist or illegal or violent. So I'm gonna actually, I'll just open things up to a conversation, but Jennie, I'll give you the opportunity to respond first. I'd love to hear from everyone what the whole of community solution, or what one whole of community solution might be to the problems that you specifically addressed in your presentation. I think we had some questions in the Q&A about legislation. Very curious to hear about that. Maybe some stuff about moderation and tech policy. You know what? I'll just shut up and I'll let you all answer the question. Jennie, why don't you go first?
So one of the key principles that I think it's important for intergenerational discussion around this is getting away from the concept that there are kind of neatly delineated heroes and villains in this, particularly when it comes to the softer edge, the kind of mis and disinformation space, and the idea that there are, you know, stupid people who are susceptible to that kind of content, and then there are those who are, you know, are able to do critical thinking. And as adults, I think coming to those conversations with humility and saying, oh, here's a time that I fell prey to something that I actually thought was very legitimate and wasn't, you know, the worst example of quote unquote fake news, but was just something that I didn't bother to do lateral reading around. I didn't check the sources on, and I accidentally shared it and, you know, provided oxygen to that idea. And I realized now that that was really unhelpful, that it's important to have that awareness that even things like conspiracy theories, which then lead into extremist paths, that there are good reasons why average people are susceptible to those ideas. And they're often to do with, you know, being in moments of social and economic crisis, being in moments where people feel acutely vulnerable themselves, where they are driven by fear or a sense of trying to create patterns out of chaos. And that, again, it's not some shadowy group of, you know, others who are going to fall prey to that. We all have the capacity to go down that path if we come across enough of that kind of information, or if we're in enough of a moment of personal crisis. So sort of coming to all of these conversations from a position of both openness and, for want of a better word, kind of empathy with why these ideas are appealing, that I think that's very important when it's adults and young people trying to engage in the same discussion around these ideas.
Yeah, empathy versus sympathy. I mean, it's so essential to understand why people can find emotional and social gratification from this. And it's not the same as excusing it.